Hello, class. Welcome to your interviews lesson. This is part 1 of 3 of the radio interview coming out of your next level radio textbook. Let's see if you are able to conduct a great interview. Let's get straight into it. Every station should have an interview policy or guide in place. Its purpose is to guide presenters in the process of conducting good interviews by instructing them to follow certain helpful techniques. Here's an example of such a policy. An interview should be considered a feature and should have all the characteristics of a feature: a beginning, a middle, as well as an end, as well as a common thread throughout the interview. All interviews must be target market related and must be passed by the program department. Most radio stations would have a policy that all interviews need to be approved by the programming department. So for instance, when I want an interview for Home Run on Why, I first have to speak to my programming manager, Pindi, who then will say they approve the interview or not. Usually how we liaise with the music interviews is I will speak to Cody, who is in the music department, and will then decide whether this interview is suitable for the station or specifically the show or not. XFM's primary target market is 16 to 24 years old, LSM 7 to 10. Urban South Africans who are trendy, progressive, and aspirational, which means the following. All of the interviews and topics should reflect a strategic objective that serves to increase the percentage of LSM 7 to 10 listeners. With regards to social responsibility, there should be across-the-board topics with a slant towards the portfolio, HIV and AIDS, and children's mandate. Interviews related to entertainment, music, sports, current affairs must strictly reflect the interests of the target market. For example, if we were to host Bobby Cooper, who is a well-known amapiano artist on our show, she is slap bam in our target market. She is young and she is trendy and she's a trailblazer, which fits perfectly into our YFM profile. XFM targets its products and messaging delivering at its composite typical listener, Joe. So is Joe. Meet Joe. Joe is young, energetic, and passionate about South Africa and the world in which he lives. Joe is a huge fan of the world of popular music entertainment. He is media and tech savvy and always on trend. To be honest, this to me sounds like a YFM listener. Joe understands his responsibilities as a young South African and global citizen. He lives boldly with these responsibilities. In other words, he's passionate about relationships, sex, friends, family, school, work, and ultimately play. Joe knows what he wants and knows that he has to create his own future. Joe loves XFM because XFM is a tribe, a group of people who talk to him, with him, and about him. Joe also uses XFM to be the first of his friends to be in the know on the latest relevant news and trends. That is, the who and the what is what. With XFM, Joe is encouraged to live boldly and to amplify lives. Quite recently, YFM launched a new streaming platform for alternative music that YFM plays. You can get it on the YFM app. We are well known for our alternative music, especially on weekends. So if you'd like to catch alternative music, then going onto the YFM app would be the place to be, because that's what YFM is known for, being young and trendy and forward-thinking. Every good radio station should compose a composite listener to help presenters know who they are talking to. We went through composite listener in extensive detail in class. It was also part of your assessment 1, where you are looking at a typical listener of a radio station. So when you think of 947, what kind of listener do you think 947 attracts? If you look at a 702, if you look at a Kai FM or a Metro or a Y, what does the listener look like? Application. The famous talk show host Larry King said that the best interviews are conversational. Your questions should come from your guest stories and not from your notes. You therefore need to be an active listener. What this means is that you need to be listening to what your guest is saying to you. What we find a lot is that a lot of presenters will read their notes or the questions that their producer have compiled, but are not necessarily following the conversation of the guest. So what you need to make sure you do is that you listen to your guest so that if there's anything that triggers your thoughts, you can then lead the conversation that way. It doesn't mean that you should not prepare for your interviews, because you should, but you should have an idea of the direction that you would like to take for your interview. XFM shows do many interviews on air. Many times, these interviews are not properly researched, produced, and executed, and are usually very boring for the listener. Usually, it's a case of guest A is available and they have many followers on Twitter, so let's get them to come in. Big mistake. Then we do a Google search about guest A and get some of what we believe to be good questions in which our listeners will be interested. Then guest A comes in and we ask them these questions. This at best leads to mediocre interviews that do very little to entertain and engage our listeners. In our previous conversations in class, we've mentioned that a guest needs to add to the show. They don't make the show, so never rely on a guest to be a crutch on your show. They're there to enhance the content and nothing more. We should want to be excellent, not mediocre, to thrive for excellence and to compete with the best interviews in the world. Our competition is not only other FM radio stations, but also YouTube, Instagram, and all other channels that our listeners go to for content. There has been a huge eruption of podcasts happening across the globe. So not only are you competing with other FM stations, but you're competing with different platforms, like I'd mentioned, including YouTube, Instagram, and now of late podcasts, which are very close to radio. So you need to make sure that you always put your best foot forward. The 6-phase approach to interview prep. There is a 6-phase approach to interview preparation that is guaranteed to lead to excellent interviews. The magic comes from phase 1 to phase 4. If you get these foundational phases right, phase 5 and 6 will follow well thereafter. Phase 1, quality test. Be selective of the guests that the show books. In order to get the best results, ask the following 4 questions. Note that you should answer yes to at least 2 of them. Are they a big star with a company like Universal Studios or a high targeted appeal? And can they tell great stories? Does one of the show players have a high interest in the guest, and will this create great entertainment? This one is important in order for the presenter to be able to engage well with the guest. If they have no interest in the interview, it also becomes quite tricky. Are they a great interview, even if they're not a huge name? The guests that you need to be bringing onto the show can't just be ordinary people that are popular and great. You need to consider the fact that they're actually able to sit in on interviews and be entertaining. Will they set up one of the players on the show in some way? If they answer yes to at least 2 of these 4 questions, then you know that you're on the right track. Spend at least 60 minutes longer preparing at the interview than the actual length of the interview. People take for granted the amount of time it takes to book an interview. Many aspects go into booking an interview. What I try to do on why is to book the interview in advance. As I mentioned, there are many elements that contribute to the interview. If it is a music interview, even much longer. Why? I need to speak to the music department about the interview and whether it is relevant for the station. I then have to ask the PR company or the manager for the music of the guest that's coming onto the show. I then need to get collateral as well as bios of the guest. I need to inform our digital team about it, and I need to inform the presenter. We then have to find suitable times in order for us to see the guest. And what we like doing is to either play a game or to prank the interviewee. Therefore, it requires a lot more time than what the interview entails. Remember to read biographies and get up to date on the person's career. For instance, the movies in which they feature on, the books that they have written. And this is if, for instance, we're having a celebrity interview on our show as opposed to a music interview. Then develop the first questions. Then develop the first set of questions. Develop a story arc, which is a reason of having the guest, in which you create a touch point. This could be a fun element that no other interviewer would do. For example, a fun activity such as a game. We do this quite a lot on Home Run. Conduct a 10-minute telephonic pre-interview interview with the guest. This is a foreign concept for the South African radio industry. However, it is very common practice in American television, as it helps to receive the best response from the guest. This should happen telephonically at least 24 hours before the actual interview. The pre-interview interview can be done by the producer or the actual interviewer. Ask the phase 2 questions here. Ask the guests about how they feel about the story arc and the fun element that they have developed. Keep notes of what questions have the potential for great answers or stories and which questions received mediocre answers. So what we mean by this is, if you had to pre-record an interview, your chances of it being a successful interview are much higher. Let's say, for instance, you wanted to play a game with your guest, and for some reason, they just don't understand the concept. If you are live on air, you have very little control about the fact that they don't understand the question. So you then have to move on swiftly because time is not on your side. As opposed to when you're pre-recording an interview, if the guest doesn't understand the game, you can play it over and over again until they do. This gives you leverage and leeway to ensure that you've got the best content that's going to air. Another crucial part is if perhaps the conversation goes on quite lengthy. If you are live, you might go over time when it comes to news, which is a little bit detrimental. But if you've pre-recorded the interview and you go over, all that is okay, because what the technical producer will then do is chop up different elements of the interview and ensure that it fits in quite nicely into the hour. Lane explains that the presenter should now go back to the drawing board after the pre-interview interview and redevelop the game plan. Make sure that you have at least 3 great stories that you want to get the guest to tell. Develop a plan of how the conversation is going to run. Plan the open-ended questions that you're going to ask. Develop and produce a fun and different element. So what I want to find out from you now is, did you pick up that phase 1 to 4 in this approach is typically done by the producer? Of course, this is where the admin comes in. This is where the organization of the interview comes in. So the producer plays a very big role in ensuring that these are done correctly. Phase 5, welcome the guest. The interviewer must sit down with the guest before the interview. Tell them what the 3 stories are that you want to get them to tell. Make them feel welcome. In other words, make their interview an enjoyable experience. Make coffee. If you have water, offer them water and so on. And it just makes them feel a little bit more welcome. Have some merchandise available for them if you have it at your station. By focusing on this human side of this matter, you make them feel more comfortable and will consequently achieve more from being there. By making them feel comfortable, you're making them feel at home, and therefore they become a little bit more relaxed. And the interview, in my opinion, will go a lot better. Finally, carry out the interview, keeping the following techniques in mind. Entertain first and sell second. Take a page from the late night talk shows and discuss what your guest is promoting during the last part of the interview. Make it clear to publicists, handlers, and so on. The show will promote the guest's projects, and the goal is to have an entertaining and fun conversation. This will benefit the guest regardless of how famous they are. Surprise your guests. Do something that will pleasantly surprise your guests. So what we tend to do on Home Run is, if our guest has achieved something remarkable, for instance, when we had Bobby Cooper in, we made sure that we had a plaque that YFM organizes. We bought her a bottle of champagne as well as a bouquet of flowers, just to say we are so proud of you to be the youngest girl to want to fill up Sun Arena in Pretoria. A huge feat that a lot of people are too scared to take. She took a leap of faith, and we wanted to congratulate her for that, and she was very appreciative of that initiative. Avoid questions that already provide the answer. Guests will not know how to answer such questions. Avoid yes or no questions. Ask open-ended questions. Be specific and follow up with questions about their perspective and feelings. A yes or no question really has a dead end. So you want to ensure that when you're asking your guests questions, you allow them to elaborate on the question. Not just yes or no, but to tell you a story and paint you a picture. Ask sensitive questions deeper into the interview. After you've established a relationship with a guest, then alternate difficult questions with easier ones. You cannot jump straight into controversial and difficult content questions. What you need to ensure is that they settle in quite nicely. You have a very easy and laid back conversation. And as the conversation gets deeper and deeper, then that's when you can ask the much harder questions. Use question clusters. These can be an effective device to help you delve deeper into someone's personality. A series of questions on one topic are best asked one at a time so the guest is not overwhelmed. I tend to see a lot of presenters asking guests more than one question. They'll say, my question is in two parts, or I have three questions for you. If you do that, your guest is then not able to remember all of these questions that you've asked. So what you want to ensure is that you're asking the questions one by one so that the guest is clear about the question that you're asking them and they're able to answer it chronologically. And you're not bombarding them with different questions and then they end up saying, what was that question that you're asking me again? It really does disrupt the flow of the conversation. So do make sure that you ask a question one at a time. Often, guests are not available for pre-interview interviews, which makes sense. In such cases, it may be wise to invite the guest after your show and pre-record the interview. A pre-recording will mean that you are able to get the best out of the guest while they are on air, as you can edit the interview afterwards to sound entertaining and engaging. Lane explains that a pre-recording does not necessarily mean that the show will not sound natural or real. It simply allows for the editing out of unimportant bits and self-promotion on the part of the guest. Again, we mentioned that it is very difficult to try and get guests to come in, not on the actual day of the interview, but to pre-record the interviews because they also love the live element. But pre-recordings are so great because you are able to optimize the entertainment and value for the listener. In the next lesson, we'll continue to look at interviews, so do make sure you tune in. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions for me, do make sure to send me a message in our WhatsApp group for Radio 2 or send me an email on nonhlanhla@boston.co.za. Until next time.